Hi everyone, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you from sunny Johannesburg about the Fees Must Fall movement. I'm going to reflect very briefly on some of the key aspects of the Fees Must Fall movement from the vantage point of my university, Wits University, although I've also had the advantage of being in contact with students from other parts of the country and have also met them occasionally since October last year. So I have some knowledge about the movement in the rest of the country. The first point to make is that the movement that came to be known as the Fees Must Fall movement, and which was inaugurated in October last year at Wits University, is undoubtedly the most significant student movement in the democratic era. For the first time since 1994, students across the country and virtually every university was involved at some point or the other in a single campaign. That campaign was initially a campaign against increase of fees in 2016 in what the students called a 0% increase, but very quickly escalated into a demand for free education at universities. So that the student movement was mobilized and united around this particular demand. But I do think it's important to remember that even though this particular campaign that started in October last year is undoubtedly of historic significance, it's important to remember that in fact students have been struggling against exclusions, against high fees, and against violence at universities for some time in the democratic era. Many of these struggles have taken place at historically black universities, what used to be called under apartheid bush colleges. Now, this is important because, in a sense, the student movement has been evolving, has been trying to develop its own character. But one of the problems it has faced is that the key student organizations have been aligned to the ruling party, the ANC. And therefore, even as students campaigned against high fees, against exclusions, they found it extremely difficult to develop a political identity separate, distinct from, and of course, potentially against the ruling party. So it has taken all of this time for a new movement to emerge that was not principally aligned to the ruling party. So the second aspect that one needs to consider in the Fees Must Fall movement is that the character of the movement from very early on was separate politically from the ruling party, even though the ANC-aligned student organizations, the Progressive Youth Alliance, was involved, particularly at the beginning, in this movement. But the movement very quickly came to define itself as the Fees Must Fall movement. And some of the key characteristics of the Fees Must Fall movement was that it initially and attempted throughout to eschew party politics. So when particular political organizations, principally of the ANC, but latterly also the EFF and other organizations, attempted to insert themselves into these movements as distinct political organizations, many of the students resisted that and in fact created assemblies that were not under the control of party political organizations. Now, at Wits University, the students met regularly, sometimes daily, and often for several hours in assemblies where they discussed, following the tradition of the Occupy movement, in detail what their strategies, their tactics, their demands should be in relation to this movement. They invoked the theory of Fanon, of Paulo Freire, and other radical thinkers in an attempt to define the politics of this movement. It was a movement that also critiqued the transformation of universities and juxtaposed that program of transformation of the universities that defined the post-1994 era with what they called decolonization. And they made perhaps two overarching critiques of the transformation that occurred post-1994. First of all, the transformation happened too slowly, and politically, that agenda of transformation was burdened by the rainbow ideology, by the notion of building a nation, which the students argued, in fact, did not fundamentally challenge the underlying power relations, both of society as a whole and at universities. And that manifested, they argued, itself in a number of things. One, that the governance structures of universities remain very hierarchical, and that university management basically ran universities in the view of the students in dictatorial ways. Secondly, the curricula of universities, again the students argued, had hardly changed in the last 20 years to reflect the African reality of the students. Thirdly, the students pointed out that the vast majority of senior academics at universities were still principally white and even male. So there were a number of things which the students pointed to, which in their view characterize the transformation of the post-1994 period, which they argued was insufficient and needed to be unsettled, and a new agenda of decolonization had to be put in place. So it's important to understand that the student movement that started off as a campaign against fee increases, much like the students in 1976, started off with a campaign against Afrikaans. And within a few hours of the 76 March, June 1676 March, the students moved from campaigning against Afrikaans to campaigning against the system of apartheid. In 2015, the students started off with a demand against fee increases to demanding the decolonization of universities. And in fact, what students have been demanding is what we have come to call a decolonized public African university. Now, what has been very interesting is that all of these ideas have been debated and contested. What does decolonization mean? What does public mean? What does it mean to be an African university? And I would say that this is perhaps one of the most exciting periods in the history of universities, because for the first time in a very, very long time, various constituencies are coming together to debate the crisis of universities and also thinking about what our university should look like. One of the manifestations of the crisis that has developed over the last 20 years is that universities are in fact public in name only. The state subsidy to universities has decreased consistently since the 1980s and continued since 1994. My university, which is a public university, only receives 25% of its income from the state. That means that the university has to, one, find external sources, therefore principally private sources, for its income. And secondly, and this has been the key source of political contention, it has to increase student fees in order to generate income. And therefore, the students and its supporters are arguing that it's critically important that the demand for decolonization, for the demand for public university, should be directed in the first instance against, or rather to, university administrations, but very importantly, also to the state. Let me make 2 or 3 points finally, as time is running out. A key feature of the Fees Must Fall movement, particularly from the end of October, early November, is that the students recognize that their struggle for free education was linked to a set of systemic problems, one of which was the privatization, the commercialization, the commodification of tertiary education. An important feature of that has been the outsourcing of workers at universities, which happened from the early 2000s. So and many of us have been campaigning against outsourcing and demanding insourcing of these workers. The students from late October, early November made this one of the key demands. And what one witnessed from that time was that as the students in their tens of thousands mobilized against outsourcing, that very quickly one university after the other agreed in principle that outsourcing was an outdated mode of labor and therefore agreed to insource workers. We now have a situation where the vast majority of universities have agreed in principle to insource workers. This is perhaps one of the most important victories by students and workers at universities in more than 20 years. One of the key debates around the Fees Must Fall movement has centered on the question of violence. Now, this has been very unfortunate because a lot of the critical discussion, particularly from the state, as well as from the university administrations, has been to try and characterize the Fees Must Fall movement as essentially a violent movement. Now, it is undoubtedly the case that some students espouse violence. A smaller number, in fact, have organized violent activities. But the reality is that the vast majority of students, and here I speak from my own experience at Wits University, the vast majority of students, 99.9% of students, whilst drawing on a particular reading of Anon, are not against violence and may even espouse the need for violence at some point in time. The vast majority of them have not been involved in violence. Yet what one has seen is that the public discourse has been shifted to characterizing the students as essentially violent. One of the consequences of this has been that particularly since the beginning of this year, the universities have become increasingly securitized. So we've had private security on all of the campuses, where the buildings of universities, lecture rooms, and so on have come under the control of private security. So whilst important gains have been made in the last few months, the securitization of the universities represents a serious crisis, a serious new crisis of the universities, as the administrations, together with the state, tries to undermine the right of protest, the right of students to debate whatever they want to do, in order to ensure that the agenda of the university administrations and that of the state are protected, and that the protest, the right of protest, is being seriously undermined. So we face a new crisis at universities, which of course in the South African context is something that has affected society as a whole. So to end off, I would suggest to you that the Fees Must Fall movement has made enormous gains. It is at a crossroads, and that crossroads is defined by the securitization on campus as well as the fragmentation of the Fees Must Fall movement, which, because of the internal political debates and an attempt by political movements to gain control of the Fees Must Fall movement, has created political, ideological crises in the movement, which the movement is trying very hard to sort out. But what we have seen, perhaps since February this year, is not only fragmentation of that movement, but also a decline of the movement. Thank you very much.